Okay, so we have been discussing different kinds of challenges coming from different sciences. It could be from natural sciences, and we've moved on to discussing some difficulties that come from more cultural sciences, such as history and archaeology. We mentioned, for example, we mentioned the story in Bereshit. This was the last time we met. We mentioned the two stories in Bereshit about the relationship between Hagar, between Sarah Imeinu and Hagar. Excuse me, I'm going to mute again and then I will continue. 1 second. Okay, so we have two stories in Bereshit that relate to the relationship between Sarah and Hagar. One of them is when Hagar, or excuse me, I have to say something else before we start that. I forgot to mention, I'd like to thank those of you who, when we ended the series in the summer, gave me a very nice gift. Thank you. It was really not anything I was expecting or I felt necessary, but thank you very much. I know at least Eliezer and Mark, who is not here tonight, were involved, and thank you very much. Also, I will mention another Mazal Tov that we had this morning, that our daughter Gitit gave birth to a new grandson who is now, thank you, who is now, he's 16 now, he's 16 hours old. So thank you, and that is also going together with the weddings. Those are also very lofty moments. In any case, I will continue. So we mentioned the two stories of the tension in the relationship between Hagar and Sarah Imeinu. Sarah, who was barren, and suggested that Abraham also take Hagar, and then Hagar is pregnant, and she as a slave, she as a female slave, what's the term in English? She kind of mistreats her mistress now, Sarah, and Sarah causes her, inflicts upon her all kinds of strict behaviors, and Hagar runs away. And the second story is later on, after Ishmael is born and Yitzchak is born, that Sarah sees some behaviors of Ishmael that she doesn't like and doesn't want to influence Yitzchak. So she has Abraham send Hagar away. And based on Hammurabi laws about these kinds of situations, we could see that what Sarah was doing was within the laws of her time and place. Also, we mentioned that at the end of Parashat Chayei Sarah, Abraham has other sons from another woman, and he gives them gifts, but he defines that the son who is going to be his heir is Yitzchak. And we find that in Hammurabi laws as well. And the point of those stories was to say the following. I'm not going to repeat it, I'm just giving a summary so we can move on to some other examples. When the Hammurabi laws and other laws from our region coming from, let's say, the 18th, 19th centuries before the Christian era, way back, more or less the time of the Avot and Imahot, when these were discovered and we found similarities between them and the Torah, there were Jews who were very taken back by this because it kind of showed that we're not so special. It's not a God-given Torah. It's just another one of these sets of laws that roamed around here in the area. And by what we did by analyzing the stories of the Torah, I would say is two things. One is, and I'll get back to this in a moment, that you see that there is I can't prove scientifically, I can't prove archaeologically that what the Torah says is true or is historical facts, but you can see that things that the Torah is describing have basis in history, in things that we had no idea about until the end of the 19th century or the 20th century. We had no idea about these laws until the 19th or 20th century. We know about burial customs in Canaan, and we know this from archaeology from the 19th and 20th century. And when Abraham buys Me'arat HaMachpelah from the Chitim, it is very clear that this has to do with the customs of the time, that Abraham has to have his own family burial area and so on. And so you see that the Torah is embedded in a realistic background that no one knew about until modern or almost modern archaeology, the last couple of centuries. And again, I don't think on the one hand that we can prove the Torah through this knowledge. Sometimes it's perceived as the opposite. It's a challenge. Oh boy, so you see the Torah isn't saying anything so special. Everybody knew these things at that time. But what I would like to say is, on the one hand, it doesn't contradict the Torah in any way. It doesn't show that the Torah is not God-given or divinely inspired or anything of the kind. It doesn't prove or disprove the Torah. It does give us an insight, an in-depth insight into the message of the Torah. I'll get back to that in a moment. But also it shows us that thousands of years ago, because nobody is arguing that the Torah is less than, let's say, 2,500 or 2,700 years old. Nobody's arguing about that. The argument is it, as it claims to be, 3,300 years old, or the stories about the Avot and Imahot, 3,700 years old? Okay, but no one's arguing that it's before 2,500 years ago. And when the Torah was spreading in Am Yisrael, they had no idea about this archaeology. So there seems to be something here, to my mind, that is showing us that the Torah knows what it's talking about. It's embedded in realistic historical background that we did not know about until 100 or 200 years ago. So again, I'm not claiming that I can prove the Torah, but I'm certainly saying if someone challenges us, or if one of us feels challenged by some kind of modern knowledge, by some modern find that archaeology will find, I suggest that we don't be so afraid of it, because I think it's quite the opposite. Archaeology, again, can't prove that the Torah is true, but shows us that what the Torah is talking about is certainly seriously embedded in what is reality of those times, and pretty far back, like the Avot and Imahot, 1,700, 1,800 BCE. That's quite a while ago. So that's pretty impressive. But the other point is that it brings depth to the story, because what I claimed was, I'm not going to get back into the detail. I'll try to give a different example today. But with the stories of Hagar and Sarah, it showed that maybe what Sarah, this is the way I interpreted it at least 2 weeks ago, that maybe what Sarah was doing with Hagar in the first story, by inflicting strictness upon Hagar, and Hagar ending up running away, maybe it was legal, but was it the high enough standard? Did it live up to the high standard that Hashem is trying to show us, Am Yisrael, and to show us through such leaders, through such figures who are, the fathers and mothers of Am Yisrael. So I think that's a very fascinating a point of depth, of sensitivity in the story that Dafka we can be aware of, because we're aware of archaeological finds. And not only do they not cause difficulty, they cause us to deepen our understanding of the Torah. And this is something that Rav Kook wrote to his disciple, Rav Moshe Zaydel, more than 120 years ago, maybe 115 years ago, that Zaydel was a young student in universities in Europe, and he was challenged by what was then these modern things like archaeology coming out. And he wrote to Rav Kook about it. Rav Kook said to him that we don't have to accept everything they say. It's not Torah min hashamayim, the modern findings are not God-given and not scientific conclusions that are beyond any doubt. But on the other hand, we don't have to reject them. We don't have to accept them. We don't have to reject them. And they come to the world so that we will have to deal with them. Because when we deal with them, we will discover a new depth or a new height in the Torah. And that's how we should relate to these issues. And I think that's a great thing. And the example about Sarai Main was one example. I'd like to give another example today, but beforehand to mention some other small challenges and then to come back to this example. Okay, or if someone wants to ask something.
Can I ask a question? I don't understand
Sure,
what you mean by it giving you an opportunity to increase the depth or the height. I like that. But for example, how does this example with Sarah enable us to see a new height or depth?
Because what it's showing me, it's in this case, it's a moral sensitivity. You can find the archaeological finds of the Hammurabi laws, and then you know that there's a law that if a mistress gave her female slave to her husband, and then the mistress had a child or became pregnant, and then she mistreated her mistress, or what kind of felt haughty and higher than the mistress, then she can be sent away or put down and things like that. So some people say, oh, you see, so we had all kinds of laws like this, and Judaism isn't so special. And I'm saying that what it's showing us is that what the Torah shows us about Sarah's behavior is embedded in reality in Canaan in those times. What Sarah was doing, what was accepted by law at that time. But what the Torah is telling us, and the Torah in that story uses the name of Hashem. In the other story, where Sarah sends away Ishmael and Hagar, the Torah uses the name Elohim. Elohim is judgment, is strictness, is justifying Sarah. Because when it was about who is going to be the heir of Abraham, you had to draw a clear black and white line and say it's Yitzchak and put aside Ishmael, as strict as that may be. And later on they can reconcile, but now it has to be clear who is the heir. But in the first story, Sarah acted legally, but that's not good enough. I'll give you an example. On the news today, before the news today, in the first story where Sarah is strict with Hagar and puts her down, she may be, the Torah uses the name Adonai or Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, which is even higher than Adonai, which is considered to be a name of mercy. And I interpreted that to mean that the Torah was saying about Sarah's behavior, maybe if I used the name Elohim, you would be okay. What you did is legal. It's within the framework of the law. But if you look at it from a perspective of mercy, it wasn't being merciful. It wasn't being sensitive. And so today I heard on the news that there are some questions about what is proper or improper for government ministers to do. And there is nowhere in the Israeli guidelines for ministers or laws for ministers anything about morality. The only thing that is wrong is if they transgress a law. If they do something against the law, then they can be put on trial, and then they lose their right to be a minister and so on. But if a minister does something which is improper, immoral, but not illegal, there is legally nothing anyone can do to that minister. And I ask us, is that good enough? Should the law be different? Should our law in Israel be different? Or maybe is it up to us to demand from our political leaders, although I'm not sure they're real leaders, but maybe they're strong politicians, but is it up to us to demand from them morality and not only legality? Or is it up to us to legislate laws about morality which may not be relevant to lay people, but will be relevant to ministers. These are questions that can come up from studying this chapter in Bereshit, and I wouldn't be aware of it if I did not know about this combination of, on the one hand, the Hammurabi law, and on the other hand, the story of the Torah and the different uses of the names of Hashem, of the different names of Hashem. So because I had a scientific find, archaeological find, that taught me to deepen my understanding of a story in the Torah. I'll give another totally different example. Before that, I'd like to give two smaller examples that don't create a deepening of my understanding, but nonetheless are interesting. I'll skip one of them. I'll only mention one. One of the famous challenges of archaeology against the Torah is that camels archaeologically are found in our area from the 13th century BCE, meaning that in the time of the Avot and Imahot, they were riding something else but not camels. And the story of Abraham sending a slave to look for a wife for Yitzchak, and he comes to Haran and he finds Rivka, the story is all about camels. So, false, not Torah, not holy, not God-given, and so on. So, first of all, let me ask you, what would you say to that challenge? It's a very well-known challenge if you've studied anything about archaeology and the relationship between archaeology and Tanakh. What would you say to that kind of claim?
Hello?
Yeah, go ahead.
That whenever it was, this whole part was probably orally transmitted, but the stories in Bereshit until later on when Moshe wrote them down. So it is possible that it was, the story took on the camels a little bit, because that was easier to explain it to whoever was telling it at that time. But I want to tell you that I had a very bad experience this Sunday. There is a Yossi Naveh who spoke, and I sat for 1.5 hours and I could not speak. I was in such shock, I couldn't react. He said that everything was Bobemeises, basically. Everything was never happened. The only time that we have any evidence was he mentioned Mesha, from the time of Omri, and from that, and he mentioned Yoshiyahu with the Sefer Torah. Supposedly, they found the Sefer Torah, but he said so Dvarim. So Dvarim.
This is clearly what's called the minimalist archaeologist.
But the way he spoke was, I don't know, and there were people there listening, and now I've never seen anything like this, but now I understand the deep hatred that people have here for Torah and Judaism. I've never seen anything like this. They believe in everything else they'll accept, any other culture they'll regard, they will speak about it with great regard, but I'm still in shock. This was Sunday and I'm still not over it. I'm sorry. So
Okay.
I apologize.
Okay, I will relate to that. But before I relate to that, I'd like to go back to, so you mentioned, Tova, one possible outlook that would say, you know what, it's true that what the Torah says isn't accurate. It wasn't camels, it was donkeys or something else. But because the story was told to people in the 13th century BC, so they told the story with camels. It's like a midrash for kids, and you use something that the kids can connect with, and so on. So you're raising a possibility, which I don't think is unacceptable, that the Torah is not interested in I want to give it kind of logic to what you're saying, that the Torah is not interested in the physical fact, what is a camel or was it something else, but is interested in the moral of the story, in the behavior of Rivka, who is the second mother of Am Yisrael and connects to the behavior of Abraham and so on, Abraham and Sarah. So this is the importance of the story. This is the message of the story. And in that sense, passing that on through the generations of Am Yisrael is what is important. And if it's going to strengthen passing this main message on, it's going to work better with camels than with mules, then that's fine. Carrie's making faces about it, and I'm okay with it. Carrie, what do you say?
It's a little weak, but also what I was going to suggest is probably even weaker, which is maybe they just haven't dug deep enough yet.
So I want to go with that and say, and give it a little background and say that some findings in certain times were that camels only reached our area in the 13th century, but others showed that there are some findings of camels earlier on, like in the 17th century. And here's an interesting point, camels were rare, not found, rare. Now, what is Abraham doing by sending his slave with camels? He's showing
how rich he is.
Oh, you see, I have a Rolls Royce. I'm sending an entourage with these fancy cars, with these fancy yachts, floating from here to Haran to show off, so that the people there will see, oh, maybe we want our daughter to go with his slave and marry his master or his master's son. So it could fit in perfectly.
And having that information of how rare they are might lead to a theory of, oh, and so all of the pieces of them after they died were, something special was done with them. And so we'll never find them because they were so special.
Okay, but the main thing is how strong is archaeology? Meaning, I don't want to make little of archaeology because archaeology has given us a lot.
Important.
But on the other hand, there are a few kinds of weaknesses to archaeology. One of them is archaeologists very often are trying to find something. Now, sometimes they may be trying to find things that will give us connection to Tanakh or give us connection to Tanakh in the Holy Land. They can be Jews or non-Jews. Someone else in a different time can be looking for things which will contradict Tanakh because that's what he wants to show.
They're working.
And a third person can be looking for a third interest, and it's never totally objective, and sometimes it's closed within a certain circle because you also have to analyze and decide what is the meaning of an archaeological find, and sometimes you have conclusions that are based on other notions that lead you to say that this is from the 13th century, but if you had other notions, you would have reached the conclusion that it's from the 17th century. So sometimes it's kind of tangled within itself. And the most important thing about archaeology is that what you didn't find doesn't mean anything. In Hebrew, it goes better in Hebrew. In Hebrew, it's called Lo ra'iti eina re'aya, which is a good play on words. If I didn't see it, it's not, it's like the words, using the word ro'eh, which is to see, and re'aya, which is proof. If I didn't see it, is not seeing proof. Meaning there could be a few reasons why you don't find something. For instance, I'll give you two examples. Someone went through Midbar Sinai looking for archaeological finds from Ma'amad al-Sinai. What do you expect to find? They didn't live there over an extended period of time. It goes back very far back in the desert. Will there be any kinds of findings? They didn't build buildings there. What do you expect to find? The post of Moshe Rabbeinu's tent. So it's not clear that you're going to find anything left. Or another example is the nation of Midian.
Right.
Was the nation of Midian in the area when the Torah claims it was? There aren't any findings of that nation, but then others claim the reason is because they were a kind of a nomadic, like a Bedouin. They were like a Bedouin nation, and they would roam around and they would attack all kinds of other places and steal and kill and take riches from others. But you won't find their areas of habitat. You won't find archaeological findings of where they lived. They won't leave signs of their culture because their culture was a nomadic culture. So you're not going to find that. On the other hand, you find letters from the period of time that the Torah is talking about, mentioning wars with this nation and mentioning, kings talking to one another, writing to one another about how do we deal with this nation. So there do seem to be certain findings that point to the fact that they were in the area, and there's a different reason why we don't find anything left from them, only from other people talking about them. So there's a lot to be aware of. You also have to be aware that archaeology in Eretz Israel is constantly developing, constantly finding new things. It's more or less pick a site, start digging, you'll find something. Now I exaggerated a little bit, and there's a lot of survey that you have to do, and sometimes it's real nitty-gritty hard work. You have to go through so much until you finally come across somewhere where you did find something. But there are all kinds of interesting findings, and maybe in the next few I'll mention some of these positive findings that were not known 50 years ago or 100 years ago, and they're known today. But I do want to give one more example that will show us how being aware of archaeology can deepen or bring us to a greater sensitivity of our understanding of the Torah, and that is the following. When Israeli archaeologists came to Eretz Israel in the 20th century as part of Zionism and started digging in Eretz Israel, and their interest was to find signs of the Tanakh in their archaeological, that's what they were looking for. And for instance, they dug in Chatzor, and they found that Chatzor was destroyed by a great fire, was a big Canaanite, if I'm pronouncing that properly, Canaanite center, city, kingdom, and it was burnt in a great fire, and that goes perfectly well with what Sefer Yoshua says, and sort of says, you see, here we find that what Sefer Yoshua says is true, and that's one of the big arguments. I'll get back to that in a moment, relating to what Tova was saying before about the minimalists and the maximalists. And so at first glance, archaeology seemed to find findings that proved that when Sefer Yoshua says that Am Yisrael entered into Eretz Israel and had a war with the southern kings and a war with the northern kings and conquered and took over, and there's a list in Sefer Yoshua after these two big wars, there's a list of 31 kingdoms that Am Yisrael conquered in Eretz Israel, and everything is beautiful and everything is great. That works perfectly well with what we found in archaeology. But when archaeology continued to develop a few decades further on, they kept on finding things that were not consistent with this, that were showing that there were other Canaanite cities that were not destroyed and that were not sent away, and that Am Yisrael could not settle in certain areas, and the idol worshippers, the Canaanite idol worshippers, were still there, and Am Yisrael settled other areas higher up on the hills, like in what is today, the controversial areas of today, like the Shomron, were areas where Am Yisrael settled more than the areas in the, around the, what's called in Hebrew, the Shfela, closer to the sea. And it seemed inconsistent with what we said before. But then if you go back to Sefer Yoshua and you read what Sefer Yoshua says, Sefer Yoshua itself has that same contradiction, because Sefer Yoshua in one place says everything that Hashem promised was fulfilled. And on the other hand, in another chapter in Sefer Yoshua, he describes, and in Sefer Shoftim, it describes the many Canaanite people who were still around, and the promises of Hashem were not fulfilled, and they're going to be a danger for Am Yisrael, and they're going to influence Am Yisrael culturally and religiously, and it's a great danger, and we didn't continue what we were supposed to do, and because of that, the development of Am Yisrael was stalled or was damaged for the long term, and hey, what's going on? And the truth is that the archaeological finds are not consistent, but they're very consistent with the inconsistency in Sefer Yoshua. So the same inconsistency that we find in the archaeological finds are consistent with the inconsistency in Sefer Yoshua. So what is all this saying? So it seems that if you read Sefer Yoshua carefully and you study the archaeological finds carefully, you will see that there are two parts to the story. One part of the story is that some parts of Eretz Israel, Am Yisrael, succeeded in conquering and settling. Some of the Canaanites were like Canaanite cities like Chatzor was destroyed and Am Yisrael took over and settled. Not in Chatzor, but other places. And some other parts in Canaan, Am Yisrael did not succeed, did not continue. It stopped, it was a first wave, but it didn't continue afterwards. And it ended up being a very detrimental influence on the continuation of the development of the spiritual, religious development of Am Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael. And the point of Sefer Yoshua, I would say, given this seeming inconsistency in Sefer Yoshua, it's not an inconsistency. What Sefer Yoshua is saying is, look, when you did it right, it was working.
Exactly.
What Hashem said was working. But you didn't continue, and then it didn't work.
Right.
So it's not saying these are 100% of the facts, and these are another 100% of the facts, and they contradict. One or a certain group of chapters in Sefer Yoshua is saying this is part of the historical reality of what happened in that generation, positive. Another group of chapters in Sefer Yoshua is saying this is a part of the reality that happened in those times, negative, and they're both true. And you know what it depends on, whether or not it's going to continue in a positive or in a negative way? It's up to you, it's up to us. So the message of Sefer Yoshua is in that generation, and for all generations, Am Yisrael succeeding in Eretz Yisrael depends on what we do and how much we follow the directive of Hashem in every different generation in the right way for that generation. What are we supposed to do so that Am Yisrael will thrive? It connects right back to what Eliezer did for us today, because again, I don't want to be negatively influenced by the negative aspects of general culture, but I don't want to lose the positive aspects in general culture. And the question of drawing the line and being able to do that is one of the major questions of the identity of the state of Israel and the people of Israel today. But Sefer Yoshua is saying, if you do it right, it works. If you don't do it right, it starts falling apart. And it's a very, very strong and relevant message today, supported by the archaeological finds, but only supported once you see the whole picture.
Right.
And now the argument between archaeologists in Israel today is there are two distinct groups. There are the minimalists, which is one of them you heard on Sunday Tova. Clearly, they start everything from the 7th century BCE, when the time of Yoshiyahu, when they find the Sefer Torah and the Mikdash, and their claim is that the whole story shows that there was nothing before, and there are clear archaeological finds from the 7th century. Nobody argues about that, except for some Muslims that don't want to admit that there was a first temple in Yerushalayim, but scientists admit, archaeologists, that there was a first temple and there was a Jewish kingdom. They question whether or not there was a Jewish kingdom in the time of David and Shlomo, a few hundred years earlier. We'll get back to that in one of our next shiurim. But nobody argues from about 700 BCE. From about then, nobody argues. But the arguments are about what happened before. And the question is, how strong of an argument is that? If you don't have, the farther back you go, the less archaeological finds you're going to find.
Right.
So how strong of an argument is that? When continuously, as we continue historically digging and finding things in Eretz Yisrael, we do seem to be finding things going farther back. And I'll give, not today, later on in the next shiurim, I'll give a couple of examples of that. Again, I'm not saying that it can prove 100% that everything is accurate, but I think it will be strong enough that it certainly does not disprove it. And there's this ongoing argument between the archaeologists. I think it's not even honest to bring a lecture that gives all this as if it's fact, as if, this scientific position, which is a legitimate scientific position. I can argue with it, and he can have it. But to present it as scientific fact,
Right.
and not as one person's or a group of people's conclusions based on certain data, rather than that, presenting it as scientific facts, I think that's dishonest. And at least if I was planning
It's not
series,
scholarly. It's not a
series-
scholarly thing.
and there are scholars in history, in the past and present, who are not Jews and are not interested in Judaism, but are interested in scholarly, intelligent,
Right.
you know,
Right. Integrity. Integrity.
Integrity, thank you. And they are critical of these kind of archaeologists who make claims that are based on lack of knowledge,
Exactly.
as if it's clear, resolutions, scientifically proven. So, you know, I would bring someone to argue and show the other point of view. But in any case, what you're saying, Tova, is an experience that many people may experience, and then they don't know what to do with it. And so part of the point of this series is to say, here, okay, if you ask the question, we have tools how to deal with this. But not only do we have tools to say what they're saying is not 100% true and it's not God-given and, you know, from some godly revelation that can't be argued with, but also there are opportunities. But then you would say, okay, so I'm not interested in this archaeology. I don't want to reach that conclusion. I want to stay with the conclusion that I am interested in the archaeology because I'm going to learn things from the archaeological finds. Sometimes they will challenge me, and sometimes dealing with the challenges is going to help me gain deeper or higher, like that, Carrie, deeper or higher understanding of what the Tanakh is saying. And first of all, I want to be honest. I don't want to ignore what the world is saying. I want to deal with it. If you told me that there's no one around who can answer these questions, maybe I would say, you know what, better, we don't have answers right now. But if I can show you that there are answers, or at least we can't prove scientifically anything one way or another, it ends up being a question of emunah. But there are tools to deal with it from a point of view of emunah, on the one hand. So I want us to deal with it. I want us to be honest. I want to show our students and our children that we can live in the world and deal with questions that come from the world. And also I want to study and see how it's going to deepen our understanding of what Tanakh is saying. Also, it might even be a point of faith, saying that there is a reason why these things came to the world. They came to the world because they're going to give us tools to deepen our understanding, or to show that we can deal with all kinds of things. So it's not only negative, because when we end up dealing with these seemingly negative things, we end up turning them into something positive. And that's why with divine, hashgacha, with
the providence.
Thank you. With divine providence, that's why these kind of things have come to the world. Thank God for challenges, and they help us grow, and they help the religious world grow. And when we complete the circle, they are going to help the world, or greater circles of Jews or of people in the world, so that they will also be able to see that these how this ends up bringing greater light to the world and not shutting out the light of the Torah.
His whole point was to prove that Am Yisrael is not special, because the Egyptians were also circumcised, but it's not true. Only the high. He said we are not special at all, because he was saying that our laws are not special. We have taken it from others. Everything we have taken.
Everything he seems to be saying is classical arguments that are way outdated.
I've never heard them before.
But I think it's important to point out that you know what, it's an opportunity, because you're hearing his lecture and experiencing and telling us what he's saying, and all of these are classic, and all we need is someone well, for the general public, someone there who would say there's a different point of view. I'm not even going to claim that my point of view is the right one, and I can prove that it's the only true, legitimate point of view, but that nothing is proven one way or another. But right now, most importantly for us in this series, is to use that experience to be able to deal with these kind of claims so that we can learn from it.
I called up and I canceled my subscription to his
Okay.
classes, and I said, I quoted from Yeshayahu, I said, "Ma'asayach u'machribayach memech yetzeu."
Okay, okay.
And I
But I'd
think,
like to bring it back. I'd like to bring it back to us. Carrie.
okay,
I have a question that's really close to what you're talking about sort of when reality gets in the way and how we deal with that. And then after that, and I also have something more related to something else to share if there's time. But my question with the first part is, one of the things that helps me to not be troubled by things that don't jive necessarily with the
Tradition?
with what?
With a traditional outlook?
No, with reality, like, you know,
okay, with reality, okay.
6 days or something like that, is all of the technology that we can see now, like honestly, fax machines. And why is that? Or the internet. And why is that? Because these are things that are so beyond what I can understand, and yet I see that they're existing and working in my world. And if I can accept that, okay, then even though I have no idea how they work, I see that they're working. I kind of apply that to all of the things that might not make sense in the Torah, or that don't fit with what I see. And I think, you know what? I can now accept not all, but, you know, I can now accept a very large number of these things that are otherwise difficult to explain from the Torah because of fax machines. So
Okay,
I want
but Carrie, I would like, I'm not going to do it.
On that logic.
Sometimes it depends what. I would differentiate, let me say, well, first of all, we did in previous shiurim, and if you would like to, I can, meet with you and discuss these examples with you privately, but we went through that kind of series of natural sciences in Torah, like the 6 days and things like that. Because like we said before about the camels, I don't think the Torah is interested in giving us physics in the first chapter of Bereshit, so I'm not sure it means anything in the physical sense, in the physics sense, in the scientific physics sense. It's more about what the messages are, but there are different attitudes towards that. There are those who do work it out with modern physics and so on. It's hard to say it's hard to put it together with 5,700 years, but in other senses. So I would lean more towards those directions, but there are different attitudes, and I think it's important to note that there are different attitudes. One of the things I would bring is a letter of Harav Kook where he raises like 3 or 4 different attitudes, a letter to the same student in Europe, Zaidel, but he raises 3 or 4 different options of how to deal with it. And initially it seems like he's like, in Hebrew we call it, I'm not sure the expression in English, is kind of, in Hebrew we say, he's shooting in all directions, I don't know what the expression is. But I think what he's doing is giving us a lot of different kinds of tools so that maybe different people, maybe different issues, maybe different times can deal with all the different kinds of things. So I think that your attitude is one attitude, and sometimes I would use it, but I think it's valuable to enrich ourselves with other aspects as well, and be able to think about the different ways of looking at things. And I would differentiate, I'll give you one example. I would differentiate between 2 different kinds of instances in the Torah. When the Torah speaks about the snake, the serpent in Gan Eden, or the mule in Bilam talking, I would go with the attitude that these are not historic stories. but it's so far-fetched that it's a prophecy, it's a prophetic vision, and not.
Right, that's what the Rambam says. All these things are.
Yes, but I'm sorry, I don't want to get into it now. I just want to say it shortly. So I would say these are prophetic visions and not historical, factual stories.
Right.
But when the Torah says about Rivka that she has some revelation of a pregnancy that's unusual, she has twins, and the twins are struggling with one another. What's going on here? So there are different attitudes in the commentators on the Torah. There are those who say it was just a difficult pregnancy. That's what the Torah is saying. You have twins. She went to ask, what's going on? Why is my pregnancy more difficult than others? And she was told, you have twins. It's more difficult. That's one attitude. But there are others who say that no, this is a divinely planned pregnancy that has to do with the history of Am Yisrael and the relationship between the Jewish nation and other nations like Yaakov and Esav. And I would go in that case with the second interpretation and not with the first one.
Right.
Because I think there the Torah is telling us a story about one of our mothers that is kind of, what's the term? It's kind of a projection of the continuation of Jewish history later on. It's saying something about what's going to happen in the future. All of Sefer Bereshit is kind of giving us a prism through which we're going to look at Jewish history in the future from the point of view of Sefer Bereshit. So that's what it's about. So if you're going to tell me that a mule said something to you, and not only the mule spoke, you answered the mule, I'm sorry, I think that's a prophetic vision and not a historical, factual occurrence. But if you're going to tell me that one of our mothers had an unusual pregnancy because this was a God-guided, divinely guided event that was part of the creation of the Jewish history, I will look at that as something which is beyond the regular, natural course of events. So I think it depends also on different kinds of things at different times. It depends on the circumstances of the story. But I think we can go about this in breadth. And you wanted to add something, but I would ask the people if they're okay with it, because we should have ended a while ago, but now it's up to everyone.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Okay, next time I won't ask. I won't.
Not to
No,
ask.
there was something that I was going to ask that I was going to share if you guys have a minute and a half, but
I have a minute and a half. It's up to
I
everyone
won't
else.
be upset if anybody logs
Go
up.
ahead, go ahead. I'm listening.
Let's say anyone who wants to, Laila Tov, you can leave and we won't be insulted. And Carrie, go on.
The story that you gave at the beginning about Sarah and having trouble with Hagar at the first time, and then the second time when she sent her out. I wanted to share something that hearing what you said about the Hammurabi code being okay, but that God has sort of higher standards than that. And what I heard about this really jives well with that, which was when Hagar, who, by the way, look at the name close to Hagar, was sent out by Sarah. She went out to the desert. There's a lot of parallels between what happens to her and what happens later to the Jewish people. We hear that by no accident that Hagar is Egyptian and she gets sent to the desert and she has no water. She runs out of water and she cries to God, and all of these things that happened to her were like these precursors for what was going to happen to us. And what our big lesson was coming out of this experience of Egypt was to be kind to the ger, which goes back to what Sarah hadn't done the first time around.
Okay, I would add, if you have another minute and a half, since you started, I would add that when the Torah in Sefer Shmot says that, you should be merciful towards strangers like Gerim, because if they cry out to me, I will hear their cry. I've mentioned this in the Dvar Torah and the Kila in the past. I would say, if you think when you read the story of Am Yisrael and Yetziat Mitzrayim, and your conclusion is Hashem is on our side, you're not reading the story properly. The story is Hashem is on the side of the weak. When we were the weak, we were purposely put into the situation of being the weak nation so that we would learn sensitivity. So that when we are strong, because we need strength to lead the world in a good direction, but when we are strong, if we misuse our strength against other people, when they're weak and they cry out to Hashem, whose side is Hashem going to be on? On the side of the weak. The point was always be sensitive of the weak. The point wasn't Hashem is on our side. That's a very different point.
Right.
Last and not least, Michael.
Thank you.
All the way from
Still in Texas, hoping to come soon.
USA.
Very quickly, I highly recommend I read it actually for a book club here and made a bunch of non-Jews read this book, which was fun. This is Not in God's Name by Rabbi Sachs.
Oh,
And it is really about what you've been talking about today. And it's very much more complicated than I can cover in a minute and a half, so I won't try, but I would highly recommend it. And just to touch on what you said earlier about what's our obligation with our political leaders, with the ministers in Israel, no different than political leadership in any other country. I think what we do matters. Barack Obama loved to say elections have consequences. Well, they do. So we have to carefully consider who you put in those positions of authority, because what they wind up doing, we're responsible for.
exactly. It's true. Very true.
I'll
Thank you
stop.
very much.
Okay.
Laila Tov here. Eliezer, once again, thank you. And I'm glad you had the opportunity.
Thank you, Eliezer.
Welcome.
Beautiful.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Oh, this is very
Bye-bye, everybody.
interesting also.